This is 7.5, Brain Notes number 1. The essential question is, what are the major portions of the brain and what are their functions? It's composed of smaller parts then broken down into even smaller portions of the brain. The major portion of the brain is the cerebrum. It is the largest, that are broken down into 4 lobes. Then surrounded by the cerebrum is an area inside called the diencephalon. You can only see the diencephalon when the brain is cut open. So it's this purple area in the middle here, but it is completely surrounded on the outside by the cerebrum. Diencephalon is made up of 2 areas called the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Another major portion of the brain is the brainstem. Notice pictured here is the entire diencephalon. The diencephalon is made up of the thalamus, which is the major portion, and then kind of sitting anterior and just below is the hypothalamus. So those 2 areas right there make up the diencephalon. Then just below the diencephalon sits the brainstem, which is made up of 3 portions. The most superior portion is the midbrain. Then the area that has the bump is the pons, and then the medulla is the last portion. Notice in the human, the pons is the largest bump on the brainstem, whereas in the sheep brain, it's the medulla oblongata. Another thing is, notice that the brainstem in the human sits vertically, and so there goes from superior to inferior. But remember, in the sheep brain, they are more horizontal, with the midbrain being more anterior toward the head, then having the pons behind it, then having the medulla, and then the spinal cord. The spinal cord would extend below the medulla vertically in the human. Cerebellum in the human brain sits below and behind, posterior and below, inferior to the cerebrum. And cerebellum, remember, means little brain. And the vermis, just like the cerebrum is broken down into 2 cerebral hemispheres, the cerebellum has cerebellar hemisphere, and what joins them together is this middle section called the vermis. Certain features of the brain are structure called gyra or gyrus. Gyri is the plural and gyrus is singular. It's basically the bumps, the hills of the brain. Those are called the gyrus. And then sulci, which is plural, and sulcus singular, is the dips or the grooves in the brain. And then fissures are deeper groove. They go deeper into the brain. Again, cerebrum is the major portion of the brain. Now, when you do a coronal section or a frontal section of the brain, you'll notice that the outer edges of the brain is darker in color. This is what is called the cerebral cortex. Recall that nerves can either have myelin or not have myelin. Areas of the brain or nerves that have myelin are going to have a wider appearance, and nerves that do not have myelin is going to have a darker gray color. So cerebral cortex, the outer portion of the cerebrum, are made up of unmyelinated nerves. The darker portions have the name cerebral cortex, but the wider area is just called the white matter. Remember, fissure is a very deep groove, so a longitudinal fissure is the line that separates the 2 hemispheres of the brain. Then corpus callosum can be seen on a sagittal view, and their job is to connect. It is the only portion of the cerebrum that there is a connection between the left and the right hemisphere. So longitudinal fissure is the groove between the two hemispheres. Corpus callosum is the connection between the two hemispheres. Again, brain has 4 lobes. Frontal lobe is located in the front near the forehead. The temporal lobe is located above the ear. The parietal lobe is the top sides of the head, and then occipital lobe is the one on the back of the head. Lateral fissure will divide the temporal and the frontal, divides the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobe. Central sulcus divides the frontal and the parietal lobe, and there is no major line separating the parietal and occipital lobe. Even the central and the lateral fissure and sulcus is not going to be very, very definite. Some brain you might see it, some brains you might not. You just need to know what lobes that it divides. And then transverse fissure, which is a very deep fissure, is a separation between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. So you have the red, in the red is the frontal lobe, in the yellow you see the parietal lobe, green is the occipital lobe, and the blue is the temporal lobe, and the pink is the cerebellum. The line separating the frontal and parietal lobe is your central sulcus, and the other fissure, which is a little bit deeper, is the line that separates pretty much the frontal, parietal, and occipital lobe away from the temporal lobe. Again, white matter is the lighter area of the cerebrum when they are made a frontal section of the brain, and the outer area, which is the gray matter, is called the cerebral cortex. Certain areas of the frontal lobe have a specialized function. One of those areas is called the primary motor cortex. It is located on the precentral gyrus, which is the area right in front of the central gyrus, that's where it gets its name. And their job is to control any kind of voluntary muscles or control of the skeletal muscles of the body. Another area of the brain is the Broca's area, is specifically on the left side, right in between almost, it is part of the frontal lobe, but it's really, really close to the central sulcus. And this little area is the Broca's areas, which is for speech. And then association area, there is not a concrete area, but portions of the frontal lobe is association area, which is concerned with cognitive function, where it's thinking, critical thinking kind of function. It stores memory, a lot of emotions, reasoning, making judgment, and your intelligence, and being able to recognize language is all part of the frontal lobe. And believe it or not, it is the least the portion of the brain that develops the latest in humans. So your frontal lobe does not develop fully until you're in your early 20s or mid 20s. That's the reason why, younger ages, teenagers have a difficult time making good decisions, because their frontal lobe is not fully developed yet. Specialized areas of the parietal lobe is the primary somatosensory cortex. Just like the precentral gyrus contains the primary motor portion, the postcentral gyrus, which is the area in the green just behind the central sulcus, is the somatosensory, which is their job is to receive sensory information, touch, sense of pain, temperature. Proprioception is your ligaments being stretched. Any of those things, vibrations, all of those senses gets received by this little strip of area of the brain. So you got the front part is the motor portion, which controls the body movement, and then you got the back part which senses information from those areas. So here on the left side is your precentral gyrus, which is in control of the motor function, and it's in the pink area. And notice, starting from the area here, we're starting with near the longitudinal fissure. You've got areas that muscles that control the knee are toward the longitudinal fissure, and then you got hip and trunk, shoulder, and as it moves down around to the side, you can see all of the different areas of the body that it controls: elbow, wrist, hand, all the way, all those muscles, and there are each portions around the precentral gyrus that they control. On the other side is showing you the postcentral gyrus. Remember that precentral gyrus are both found right on the left and right, and so is the postcentral gyrus. It's just that this one is dividing the left and the right, but you can find this on both sides. The postcentral gyrus, remember again, is behind the central sulcus, and it controls the sensory. So this portion is receiving information from the knee, the leg, the trunk, the neck, all of the different areas of the body, all of these areas. So the information coming from these areas go directly to these sensory areas, and then whatever function that needs to be carried out gets carried out by the precentral gyrus. Keep in mind that the right side of the brain controls the left side, and the left side controls the right side. So if you actually had a damage to the left precentral gyrus area, then you're going to have paralysis of muscles depending on what area it is on the right side. So damage to the left will affect the right, the damage to the right will affect the left. Same thing, if you had an area of the postcentral gyrus that were damaged on the right side, then you will have no feeling on the left side of that body depending on what area it is. So if we're talking about area here that is affected, then it's going to cause misinformation or information not being sent from the fingers to the right side of the brain on the left hand. So you're going to have numbness on the right hand. Specific areas of the occipital lobe is the primarily visual area for vision and recognizing objects and putting a name to it and seeing that what it is all part of the occipital lobe. The primary function of the temporal lobe is for olfactory, which is the sense of smell, and auditory, which is an area for hearing. 7.5 notes homework. Number 1, what are the 4 lobes of the brain and what are their functions? Number 2, what function do cerebellum have? Number 3, what are the divisions of the brainstem and diencephalon?